Good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, May 28th, and in today's screencast, we're going to go over pages 12 and 13 in your packets, so get those ready. So yesterday, we talked a little bit about a very important invention called the printing press and how it does a lot to impact the lives of people during the Renaissance. It brings them the ability and opportunity to access information and knowledge, where in the Middle Ages prior to this, that access to education and knowledge and writing was really only available to the upper class, to the wealthy. But as the printing press produces books cheaper and produces more of them, more people learn how to read, and information can be spread incredibly fast and incredibly far. So the big event of this unit that is kind of spurred by the printing press is called the Protestant Reformation. So today we're going to introduce that to you, talk a little bit about some of the causes and what the words Protestant and Reformation really mean. Before we go on into the packet, I just want to point out a reminder that tomorrow, after we go over a couple more pages and get introduced to Martin Luther, there will be a Google form of a couple of review questions. And I also want to point out that on the stream of our Google Classroom, yesterday I posted a very important announcement about an adjustment of the letter codes that I'm using at Aspen. I had been using letter N to basically put in there any assignments that I had not received yet, that were not turned in by you guys yet. But for some reasons that I'm not really sure of, but tech reasons, that was not showing up to you or your parents. It would just be blank or say ungraded. So I did make a change, and now there are N capital and little n in its place. So this should make it a lot easier for everybody to see, if you're using Aspen, what assignments you are missing. And a lot of people have been using Google Classroom to find out and track their assignments, which is also very good. But Aspen is another way that you can do that. And if you're comfortable and used to using Aspen, now it's a little easier to see what you're missing. Okay. All right, so let me give you a little overview of pages 12 and 13, show you what we're going to look at today. On the first page, we're going to take a little look back into the timeline of what is happening in the church in the later part of the Middle Ages going into the Renaissance years. We'll talk about a couple of key people, John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. And then we'll discuss what Protestant and Reformation, what those two terms really mean. And we'll do a little See, Think, Wonder to introduce you, get you thinking about what the Protestant Reformation was all about. All right, so on page 12, our directions and our question for today is, what was the Protestant Reformation and what were its causes? So to begin, I have a quick little timeline of what is happening in the church, Christian church, from the 11th to the 15th century. And I want you guys to take a few moments to read through this on your own, but I do want to point out a couple of terms. So there's two events here that are called schisms. And a schism is basically a split. It's a break in an organization. And the very first term on this timeline is the East-West Schism of the church. So it's saying that in 1054 Common Era, the church split into two parts. Western, which is what we call the Roman Catholic Church, and the Eastern Church, or what we call the Orthodox Church. So quick, if you kind of recall and think about the fall of the Roman Empire back in the first couple centuries of the Common Era, they had to split for different reasons, but they also created an East and a Western half of the Roman Empire. And if you remember, the Eastern half lives on and becomes the Byzantine Empire, and the Western half, more of Europe and the European nations that we know of today, that area becomes medieval Europe, the Middle Ages that we learned about with kings, knights, and the feudal system. So in 1054, the church is kind of splitting along those same lines. The Orthodox Church exists in places like the Byzantine Empire, and the Western or Roman Catholic Church becomes the church that we know was very powerful in the Middle Ages. And they both had kind of their different styles. The Pope was the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, the Western Church, and they were the ones who were calling for crusades, and the only ones that could really read and write Latin in the Middle Ages. Whereas the Eastern Orthodox Church in the Byzantine Empire had a little bit of a different style. They kind of rejected the authority of the Pope in the Western Church. They had their own leadership, and they also had their own style of worshiping God. What they did during ceremonies, how they used statues and icons and things like that. So we're already starting to see a split in where the church is going. So I want you to pause here, read through the rest of this timeline, and think about this first question. What problems did the Catholic Church experience during these centuries? Pause here and come back in just a second. Okay, so we're going to answer these questions together after you've taken a few moments to look through our timeline. So let's go over to our slides and we'll answer these together, and I'll reveal some answers for you. Okay, so we read a little bit about two schisms, a little bit of recall about what the Crusades were, and some information on our two key figures, John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. So what problems in all of these years show that the Catholic Church is experiencing problems from the 11th to the 15th century? Well, first is that whenever there's a split, that means that there's division, that people are not agreeing and they're going their separate ways. That's not always a good thing. Unity is a good thing. So the fact that the church is splitting into two halves, Western Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, means that there is a disagreement in the Christian church at large. And then in the 1380s, soon after the Black Plague, people began to challenge the authority of the church. John Wycliffe challenges the church, attacks their writings and sermons. And this is not coincidental. Remember, after the Black Plague, the power of the church started to weaken. A lot of people who had been praying really hard for an answer, for a cure, trying to suffer through the Black Plague, and they started to look at the church and looked at God and said, you're not delivering us from this. We're going through this for years and years and years. There's no cure. People are dying. And they started to question whether the church really had the power that people had, clergy and the Pope had said it did. And then in 1378 to 1417, in the western part of the church, several men claimed to be Pope. So we know that there's only one Pope nowadays. But back in these days, there were some times where the church was splitting into different camps, different factions. And at one point, there was a couple different cities where people claimed to be the Pope and claimed that they wanted to run the church from that city. There was Vatican in Italy. There was also Avignon, France, and one other one I'm forgetting the town of up in Europe. So there's also a schism, a split between the leadership of the Catholic Church too. So lots of division, lots of different parts of church authorities question each other. Sounds like there's a need for unity, a need for agreement. We'll see if that happens or not. So question 2, who were John Wycliffe and Jan Hus? Wycliffe and Hus were men who challenged the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. They felt that individuals, common people like peasants, should be able to read and interpret the Bible for themselves and not have to rely on the Pope or some clergy person like a priest to tell them what the Bible said in Latin. So remember, in Latin, in the Middle Ages, Latin was the old language of the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Roman Empire. The typical peasant on a manor somewhere couldn't read or write at all, and if they did, it was probably in the local languages, not in the fancy Latin that Rome used to use. So people really relied on the church, the Pope and clergy, to tell them what the Bible meant and what it said. And we're going to start to see that sometimes that interpretation goes a little bit too far. The church starts to abuse that power. So what did the church do to some of these challengers like Jan Hus, and why did they do that? Well, what happens to Jan Hus is he was declared a heretic, a non-believer or a disbeliever, because he held views that went against the church's power. So the church burnt him at the stake. They wanted to make an example of somebody who would go to such great lengths to call out the problems in the church and to question the authority of the Pope and other clergy. All right, so this is just a little heads up as to some of the things that we can expect to see in the Protestant Reformation. So clearly there's some problems in the church, and there are some people that are challenging the authority. Well, the name of this whole event, Protestant Reformation, really comes from those people who started to challenge the church. So let's break apart the two terms here, and we'll come up with a nice definition of Protestant Reformation. So a Protestant is basically a protesting person. So to protest means to challenge or dissent, to go away from the beliefs and line of everyone else that's following them. And an aunt is a person who does something. So this is a protestant, or a person who is challenging or dissenting. Now, Reformation pretty much means exactly that, to reform. So just like Renaissance, rebirth, means to be born again or to discover again. Well, in this word, it's a reformation, the process of shaping or making something again. So our definition for this event, the Protestant Reformation, it was a 16th century religious, political, and intellectual, as well as cultural revolution that sought to change or remake the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church in the western part of Europe. In Northern and Central Europe, reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin protested and challenged church authority. So a lot of you guys out there who might be Christian and have Christian families, you could be, you might call yourselves Catholic, you might go to a Baptist church or even a Lutheran or Calvinist church. Or Episcopalian and Methodist. There's lots of different divisions in the Christian church. They're all Christian, but there's different divisions, slightly different ways of practicing that religion. If you are Catholic, Lutheran, Calvin, etc. So this is where all those different parts of the Christian church come from. So we're going to do a See, Think, Wonder to find out exactly what these Protestants, these Protestants, are protesting about. So let's go over to our slide so we can analyze this a little closer. Okay. So in this picture over here, we have lots of people. We have some things on a table. And yes, I'm sure your attention has been drawn to this little dog in the left corner sitting below the person in authority. I don't know why that dog is there. It definitely draws your eye. I wish I could tell you why that, if there's any kind of symbolism, but I don't think there is. We want to kind of focus our attention on what's going on between these two groups of people. So in our first box, we always look for at least three things that we see, something that we think is having some action or meaning that we observe going on in this picture. And I want you guys to pause here for a second, take a few minutes to just analyze, think, look at what's happening, look at details, and come back and we will fill this out together. Okay, so the first thing that I see is the people up on top here, to the left of the picture. These men are very fancily dressed. They have all kinds of fancy hats, whether it might be some kind of crown or a large or wide brimmed hat. Very, very different from the rest of the people down here. The second thing that I see as I'm looking at the table is that there's money. There's clearly coins being laid out. This guy even has a little like change purse, kind of old, coin sack that they used to carry around. So there's some kind of monetary transaction being held on this table. The other thing that I see on the table and in the hands of these guys up here are papers. Something that looks very important looking, that they might be writing or recording on these papers. The other thing that I want to point out, and I don't know if this is something that you guys noticed, is that the artist is intentionally drawing some people higher up, elevated in some kind of position of authority or importance. And then the rest of these people are all kind of clustered and huddled down lower. They're sort of like at the mercy of whoever is in charge that is being put up higher. All right, so for the next two parts, I'm going to kind of let you guys do these on your own, but I want to give you some tips. Because what you think is happening in this image based on what we've identified could be a little different based on how you interpret or perceive those things. And of course, everybody's questions about what you might not understand or what you see, some of those things might not be explained yet. This is going to be very individual to you as well. So for the think box, based on what we observed, based on these things here, what do you think life was like for Christians in the 15th century Europe? So answer this on your own, but here are some thinking tips. So remember, guys, these are not answers. These are not responses that I want to see just copy and pasted into your note packet boxes. These are things to help you form your own answer. So think about, how is the artist depicting the relationship between the clergy and the common people? The fact that these guys are up here elevated high and these people down here are lower. What do you think that means? And then also, what might the actions in this drawing mean? What could be written on these papers? Why use money? What do you think is actually happening in this action between these two groups of people? And for the wonder box, again, answer this on your own, but think, is there anything that is not clearly perceivable? Do not leave this blank. Some people are leaving these things blank saying, I have no questions, nothing else. I find that very hard to believe because there's always something that doesn't make 100% sense when you're just looking at a picture. They say a picture represents 1,000 words. Well, I'm pretty sure that all those thousands of words of information are not just suddenly, clicking in your brains. There's always something you can ask a question about. So do not presume that you know everything about what's going on in this picture. Come up with some kind of question. All right, guys, so that gives us a little introduction into what the Protestant Reformation is defined as. A little intro into some of the causes, the splits, and the people that are challenging these different faults and problems in the church. And that is exactly what we're going to look at tomorrow. Some of the abuses and the issues and problems that the church was experiencing, causing these Protestants or protesting people to challenge the authority of the church. So that is what is coming up tomorrow, along with a couple of review questions on a Google form. And again, if you guys have any questions, please email me. And remember that the Aspen letter code is now changed, so take a look at that. If you're used to tracking your progress and your assignments on Aspen, it should be easier and clearer for you to follow. All right, guys, have a great day. We're almost to the end of the week, and we get a nice weekend before our final 2-week push to the end of classes. So have a great day, and I will see you back here tomorrow.